Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. Today, I'm talking proposal writing and proposal management with Wendy Frieman. Wendy is a member of the Skyway team. She's also certified by the APMP, the Association of Proposal Management Professionals, and is a certified professional contracts manager with over 30 years of experience in the proposal writing and winning business world. That was a really weird way to say that. Anyway, let's get started with my conversation with Wendy Frieman. Welcome back to the podcast, Wendy, and thanks for recommending a topic. Today we're going to be talking about the question and answer process that takes place during the RFP zone after the final request for a proposal has been released. And tell me again, and for the listeners' benefit, why did you think this would be a good topic for the podcast?
Well, thanks, Paul, and it's great to be back. The reason this topic came up is the experience I had on a recent proposal where there was a debate between the capture team, the proposal team, and the contracts staff about whether to ask a specific question. That went on for 3 or 4 meetings, each one of which was at least an hour. And then once there was finally a decision to ask it, there was endless back and forth and email traffic about how to word it. I mean, really down to the semicolons and the commas and what should be in italics. And
of course.
At the end of the day, it had absolutely no impact. The RFP remained exactly the same as it had been. And we really should have been using that time to refine our solution and get our price down because we were still significantly higher than the desired price to win. That made me think about the process.
All the time spent agonizing over what to ask and how to ask it that could have been spent 2 whole days, that could have been spent writing a better proposal or doing a better job of telling your story or figuring out how to lower the price. I've been there. Maybe not 2 whole days, but I've definitely wasted time asking questions that didn't change anything in the end. Requests for proposals are complicated. The government spends a lot of time writing and reviewing these things. There are many, many moving parts, pages and pages of documentation, usually written by multiple authors. So inevitably, something in one section conflicts with something in another section, or there's typos, or references to obsolete documents, or other inaccuracies. And imagine this, the government doesn't always start from scratch. A lot of times the government uses the last RFP for something similar that they bought as the starting point. So sometimes you read an RFP and you see something that doesn't make any sense at all unless you were buying the last thing that RFP was used for.
Yes. So, it's funny, Paul, because really the process of putting together an RFP on the government side is not unlike the process that industry uses to put a proposal together.
Yeah.
It's lots of different types of expertise, got to come together. There's supposed to be version control. There's supposed to be consistency, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. So that's why the government lets bidders ask questions, within limits.
Right.
So there's some typical conventions. There's usually a due date beyond when questions are not accepted.
Right.
Although my own personal philosophy is if it's an important one, send it whenever.
Right.
Because questions do get answered if they're submitted sometimes after the deadline.
Yeah.
The deadline is not always as hard and fast as it appears in the RFP.
If you can save the government a disaster, they might answer a question after the deadline if they go, wow, this is something that's going to screw everything up if we don't get this answer out there.
Absolutely. In addition to the due date, there's a convention in which the answers are typically shared with all the bidders, but not the identity of the offerer who asked the question. Typically, the government wants to see questions asked in a certain format. So sometimes, for example, they'll say, please provide the RFP section number, page number, the RFP text. But in any event, it's probably a good idea to develop a format and be consistent about it if the government does not provide one.
Yeah. It's hard on the government side when you get dozens of questions and you have to figure out what the question is referring to and how. It's a great from an organizational sense that the government says, ask me the question like this, so it's easy for me to find the answer, easy for me to provide the answer back to you in a way that everybody understands.
And then the questions only go to the contracting officer. They don't go to anybody on the technical side or the program staff. So those are just like some of the normal practices around the question process.
Yeah, that's what I'm pretty used to as well. At the end, during this stage of the source selection, when the final RFP has been released, communications are locked down and they can only flow through the contracting officer. That helps with consistency and it helps reduce chaos. Let me provide a little bit of background here about questions and timing so that people know where we are. Before the final request for proposals is released, the government can communicate one-to-one with any bidder, and they can answer questions privately. They don't need to answer, like you said, publicly is one of the conventions during the final RFP. Anything that really impacts the request for proposal or the evaluation criteria, they have to include those in the final RFP because there's no secret evaluation criteria allowed. You can't wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah, if you say this, we'll award to you. It shouldn't work that way. Sometimes the government entertains one-on-one meetings during the industry day process in order to answer questions privately without shouting them out in the room. And although that's very structured usually and time limited because they want to treat everyone fairly. And lastly, if there's a draft request for proposal, sometimes questions are handled formally, just like a final RFP, meaning they're collected and published publicly for everyone to see, which can really limit the value of the questions because no one wants to ask proprietary questions. No one wants to ask questions that give away their solution or might help their competitors. So they tend to not ask a question rather than risk losing that edge. So again, we're not talking about before the final RFP. We're talking about final RFP has been released, communications are locked down, only the contracting officer may receive questions or answer questions, and there's a formal process for doing it. Let's talk about common traps that bidders fall into, common issues that they have during this phase. The first is asking questions that point out errors that don't really need to be corrected in order for bidders to respond, in order to write your proposal.
Yeah. So like one example of this is if the RFP, there's a page numbering error in the RFP. Okay. What are we doing by asking that question? We're showing the government that they were sloppy.
Right.
Do we really need to ask that? Probably not. We don't often have to refer to RFP page numbers when we write our proposal. So that's the kind of one that I would think twice before asking. And also just in terms of economy of effort, the more time spent on questions like that, the more likely we are to sort of miss some of the big ones.
Yeah.
So it's a very easy trap to fall into. And sometimes I almost have the sense that proposal teams take some sort of strange pleasure in finding these errors.
It's like gotchas, right? It's really like poking the government in the eye, saying, oh, you screwed up. This says page 13 twice. And it doesn't mean anything. And it doesn't make the government feel better about evaluating your proposal. So better to, if you don't have a question that you need in order to respond, better to just leave those kind of inconsistencies out there. Everyone knows they're there. Next common trap, asking questions that reveal inside knowledge about the bid that competitors might not have. How does that play out?
Well, this happens most often when there's an incumbent that's bidding on a recompete for their work, because they have all this detailed knowledge about the equipment, about the infrastructure, and they'll ask some kind of question that reveals information that would allow somebody else to come in with a solution that costs half the price, but it has the same functionality that the competitors never would have known to propose if they hadn't revealed the existence of that particular application or system.
The incumbent
That's just one example.
The incumbent has that competitive advantage, not unfair. It's a competitive advantage because they've done the work, so they know it. And they ask a question that's specific to that knowledge that they know that wasn't a part of any of the RFP. So there you go. Everyone else now has this little nugget themselves. I've seen that happen too. Next trap, waiting too long, asking questions too late for the government to respond.
Yeah, particularly if the questions are complicated and it's at a point in the proposal where when you get the answer, you're not really going to be able to redo your proposal to respond to it. But there is a reason that this happens. And everyone knows that you should ask earlier, but often people start writing, they start creating text, they start having reviews. And in that process, they discover questions that they should have asked earlier.
Yeah, I've been there, Wendy. You read the RFP, you've read it 3 or 4 times, and then you're finally writing stuff, and suddenly something in the RFP doesn't make sense the way it did the first time, a couple times you read it, and you wish you would have read it more closely. But sometimes it wouldn't have mattered. It wasn't until you started trying to apply it to your proposal that question becomes clear. And then, oh no, we got a week to go until it's time to submit. There's not enough time to ask it, get the answer, and get an answer that actually helps us provide a better response. That leads us right to the next common trap that bidders fall into with Q&A, and that's asking questions that elicit an even more confusing answer.
Yeah, and it's very easy to fall into this trap, and there is a couple of different ways in which it plays out. One source of confusion in terms of the answers is often the result of bundling. So, for example, a bidder would say, is the page limit for resumes 2 pages or 3 pages? And do the resumes have to be signed?
And the answer is yes. Right.
Exactly. So whenever possible, I like to pull them apart and make the questions as discrete as possible.
Yeah. Even if it leads to you asking a lot more questions, it's better to ask them so that they can be answered succinctly and clearly so that everyone understands. And I can flip that. There are sometimes questions that are not yes or no answers, that should not have yes or no answers, that the government answers yes or no to, that confuse everyone even more. Because it's kind of like asking, what color do you want the car to be? Yes. That's maybe an extreme example, but that's what it feels like sometimes when the government doesn't completely answer a question. It makes it even harder. Now you're even more confused about what is trying to happen. Sometimes that leads to more questions. Sometimes that just leads to proposals that don't actually meet the requirements or aren't awardable because the offerors didn't understand what the request for proposal was asking for. Which, we're going right down the list here. That leads right to the next common trap, which is asking questions about the answers to the questions, and then more questions about the answers to those questions, and on and on and on.
Yeah. And so while this is going on, the clock is ticking. And again, you've got the resource allocation and how are you making use of your people's time and the hours in the day. So on a recent bid, I was working with a team that was, it was incumbent work. That there was a recompete for them. And there was a funded position on the contract that was a contractor position for IT security, and it had a specific name. And there was some confusion about how that was represented in the pricing tables. And so the team asked a question about it. And the answer that came back was, this is a government position. And everybody knew it was not a government position. And there were a subset of people who wanted to keep going around and trying to get the government to answer the question correctly, as opposed to putting in some notes in the pricing, making the best possible assumption, and moving on. Because at the end of the day, they never corrected that answer. It was always incorrect right until the end.
And you could have spent hours re-asking the question in different ways, trying to get the right answer, rather than just saying, all right, they don't get it. We're going to move on and do what we know is right. Okay, Wendy, a couple more. I think these are the biggies. These are the traps that bidders can fall into that can be fatal to your proposal effort. Not saying the other ones can't cause problems, but these are really leading you to disaster. The first is waiting for answers to your questions before you proceed with writing your proposal.
Yeah, and sometimes what people do, which is almost as bad as waiting for the answer, is they try to set up some contingencies for different answers. So suppose the government says this, then we're going to do that. Suppose the government says A, then we're going to do B. And it gets, how shall I say, over-engineered. And the smarter the people you're working with, the more likely they are to over-engineer it, as opposed to simply saying, here's the answer we would like to see. Here's the answer we're going to assume. And at such time as we get something different, we'll stop in real time and adjust at that point. There's some things you cannot engineer.
Yeah, you end up writing 3 different proposal sections based on 3 imagined answers, and that's incredibly time-consuming, draining to do, and just gets confusing. I love that advice. Move on with what you think the answer should be to make your proposal the best proposal that they have. And if they come back and say something else, reassess. But spend the time while you're waiting for the answer writing to what you need the answer to be, and do the best job on that part of the proposal that you can. The other big trouble you can get into asking questions is if you fail to ask questions that relate directly to proposal compliance. Like when there's a page limit on one section that conflicts with a page limit that's referred to somewhere else.
And it's honestly, it's easy to miss those.
Yeah.
And that's why we're going to talk a little bit at the end about reading an RFP. It is really super important to get all those instructions down and make sure that there's no ambiguities or confusion about what constitutes on-time acceptance of the proposal. Do you have to maintain proof of delivery, especially now, Paul, with all the remote work and so many uncertainties about delivery and about capacity of the network. Everything is tentative and contingent. So getting clarity about exactly what constitutes on-time delivery is huge right now. And I think we're going to be in this state for a while.
Yep. Getting that first review of the proposal to lay out all of the compliance points and making sure you understand how to write a compliant proposal upfront is very important. If you don't ask those questions, if you make your assumption and you guess wrong, your proposal might not even be evaluated, and all that work's down the drain.
So, Paul, I have a question for you.
All right.
Because I run into this a lot. The government will push out a large number of answers to questions, and some of them really do have an effect on the text in the RFP, but they don't actually go back and update the actual RFP.
Oh, yeah. It's so nice to receive a conformed copy that's updated, or I guess it'd be an RFP revision that cleans all that up. But that takes a lot of time and energy.
Legally, what is binding?
Good question, Wendy. Legally, what is binding? I don't know if I know the answer to that.
So the protest dockets that I've read, I mean, some people go to ball games. I read protest dockets. They have all said that the answers in effect constitute the RFP in that instance.
Yeah, so it's the most recent information you have overrules the previous information. That makes
something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. What I was thinking of when you asked the question, the government sometimes waits till the very end and answers all the questions at once rather than piecemealing them out as they come in. And sometimes that's just for efficiency purposes. Sometimes it feels like that's just to confuse offerers and not give them time to respond. It's a weird situation, but I have seen what you're talking about where a ton of answers come out with a week left to go in the proposal process. The RFP isn't impacted. You spend half of that last week trying to figure out how each answer to each question impacts the rest of the RFP, which is something that the government didn't provide. That's a very confusing situation. So we should say at this point that government folks, when possible, issue an RFP revision that makes clear any changes that have occurred as a result of the Q&A. What you don't want to do is have people misunderstand, then lose, then protest, and you have to go through all the time and effort, even if it's ruled the way that you're talking about, Wendy, that the answers rule over the previous version of the RFP. That's still a ton of time and energy spent responding to that just to get to where you could have been if you would have updated the RFP. And I was probably guilty of that myself when I was a contracting officer. I was probably guilty of just answering the questions and not thinking about issuing a proposal revision. But that's a really good question. Floored me there for a second. While I'm talking about the government, let me get a little more specific about why the government cares about RFP questions. No request for proposal is ever going to be perfect. So don't take questions from the offers as a personal affront. The offers are asking questions because they don't understand what you wrote. It doesn't mean that they're calling you names or saying that you did a bad job. They just want to understand. Answering questions promptly and clearly means that your request for proposal is going to result in better proposals from the offers, more cost-effective solutions that have a higher likelihood of meeting your mission requirements. It's a good thing. Questions are a good thing. That means they're reading it. They're not just responding. And whatever you do, government folks, don't answer something like yes or no, unless yes or no is clearly the only answers that are necessary. And don't answer see RFP section L.2.13 or something like that. Don't refer to another part of the RFP in a vacuum as the answer to the question. The offers read the RFP. They don't understand something. Telling them to read it again or read somewhere else on the RFP is kind of an insult. It doesn't do anything to get you the result you want, which is a well-written, compliant proposal that is awardable. And I say that because I'm sure that I answered exactly that way. Just thinking, hey, what is wrong with these offers? Couldn't they read my beautiful RFP? The answer's right there for them to see. I'm just going to point them at that part and step away. Well, they already read it and told you they don't understand it. So pointing them back to it or pointing to another part isn't going to help. Try to be complete. Try to have a little empathy for the fact that you've been living with this RFP for quite a while as it's written and reviewed, and they're reading the final thing for the first time. All right, I'll get off that soapbox, Wendy. Back off of the government, folks, and let's talk about why industry is so focused, why they care so much about being able to ask questions about the final RFP.
Well, a number of reasons. First is the offers have, in some instances, an opportunity to shape the RFP through carefully crafted questions. So, for example, if your organization has a certification that's particularly difficult to get, you could ask, is this a requirement? And I have seen this happen where after the Q&A, it wasn't in the RFP originally, but after the Q&A, the amendment comes out and says, yes, XYZ certification is a requirement. Now, that cuts both ways, right? Because you've also given away some competitive information. But if you're pretty confident that the number of organizations that have that cert is a small number, then you've actually eliminated a bunch of your competition.
Yeah.
So that's just one example of how you can effectively use questions to shape.
Yeah, we usually recommend that shaping be done as early as possible in the market research zone before the final is released, because it's way late in the process to trust that something you need from a shaping perspective is included after the final is released. But you're absolutely right. This is your last chance to get those thoughts into the government's head. And it's their last chance to update the final request for a proposal in a way that can help you win.
And there's other reasons why industry cares. The most important one really is that if you don't get clarity through this process, if there's ambiguities in the RFP that regard compliance and you don't get answers, you risk being disqualified.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, Paul, not having your proposal read or evaluated. So that's really the main reason why industry cares about this, is that it's done correctly. It eliminates the possibility of submitting a non-compliant proposal.
And non-compliance proposals aren't any good for the government either. What if the best solution, the thing that actually solves your problem, that is the best for your mission, isn't awardable because they misunderstood confusing compliance instructions, and you can't even award to them? That's terrible. Timely answers to offers questions can make the difference between receiving compliant proposals that are awardable and not. And from the industry side, it can make the difference between winning and losing. That's why it's so important to take offer questions seriously. Well, first, it's so important for industry to write well-crafted questions that clearly explain what they don't understand, why it's important for the government to be thoughtful about answering those questions in a way that helps all of the offers submit a better proposal. Okay, Wendy, we're going to wrap this up soon. Before we do, final thoughts?
I think that for people in industry, the importance of that initial analysis of the RFP cannot be overstated. And this is going to sound like a funny thing to say, but people don't know how to read, okay? No, let me explain what I mean by that. The eye will play tricks on you. And so if you're reading text, particularly sentence after sentence after sentence, if there's a RFP section that's sort of in a narrative paragraph form, and it would make sense for a certain word to be there, your eye is going to see that word, even if it's not there.
Yep, happens all the time.
So the decomposition of the RFP so that each sentence is in a different cell in a table makes a huge difference in what you're going to catch and what you're not going to catch. Because you don't read an RFP like the way you read War and Peace. It's not a book.
And you don't curl up on the couch with a cup of coffee.
Your eyes will glaze over if you try to read it that way. Right. So it is essential to decompose it. In addition to that, it's super important to give certain sections of the RFP, the decomposed RFP, to people with the expertise to be able to pick out the inconsistencies and the ambiguities. One person cannot be responsible for going through it top to bottom and figuring all that out. That's super, super important. The second piece really is all about the triage and figuring out which are those questions that you really have to have an answer to in order to submit a compliant proposal, and let the other ones go. Make a decent assumption, document your assumption, be prepared to justify it, and move on. Otherwise, the process, the Q&A back and forth, it will eat up many, many hours, and it will not result in a more clear RFP.
Right. I think it's important to ask the questions correctly. It's not enough just to lob a question out there. That's why, like you said at the very beginning, you could spend a whole day massaging the words in a question to get the response that you want. Getting those words right, and even providing a recommended change to the RFP or recommended language or updates is the safest path to getting the government to say, yeah, that is a better way to say it, or that is a more clear way to say it. We'll just use that language in our response. One last thing for the government folks. Remember, don't be offended by questions. No one's trying to criticize your work. The more quickly you answer and the more clearly you answer, the better proposals you'll get. And if you answer a question that has a major change to the RFP, that really changes something about the requirements or the price or pricing or the compliance of how to build the proposal, please give industry a little more time to write their proposal. Don't answer questions with 2 days left before proposals are due that require major rewrites or repricing, because it's just not enough time to give you the quality response and awardable response that you're looking for. And with that, Wendy, thank you so much again for dropping some really heavy knowledge on us here today. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, and I hope to have you back again soon.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for joining us today on the Contracting Officer Podcast. If you enjoy our podcast, we invite you to check out the Skyway community at skywaymember.com, where you can get more great proposal insight like we just got from Wendy Frieman from our team of contracting officers. To learn more, call us at 877-884-5280, or again, skywaymember.com. All right, we'll see you next week.